everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on Channel 9 on WJOPLP Newburyport at FM 96.3 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I am so happy this morning to be welcoming a favorite and frequent guest. Anthony Guerriero is here again. Anthony is an historian, and he's also a former faculty member with the history department at Salem State University. He's taught everything from world civilization to U.S. constitutional government to the American presidency. And he's been here before to teach us about a range of fascinating characters in American history, ranging from Thomas Jefferson and Jackie Robinson to baseball player / spy Mo Berg. Today, he's going to be talking to us about the New Deal era Civilian Conservation Corp and what makes it relevant to the times we're living through today. Anthony, welcome, and thank you so much for coming back to the morning show.
Good morning, Mary, and thank you very much again. It's always good to see you, and thank you for the opportunity.
Well, it's always my pleasure. So, Anthony, the first thing I wanted to ask you was, what initially engaged your interest in researching the Civilian Conservation Corps?
Well, Susan, Mary, like you said, not only a teacher of history, I'm a student of history, and a student of history who has a deep appreciation for the outdoors. And living in the North Shore, he's surrounded by this beautiful scenery and old-fashioned New England. And I didn't realize it until when I became an adult, a place that I've gone all my life as a student, as a little kid on a field trip. I'll go with my parents or my wife and son. Breakheart Reservation in Saugus was built by the CCC. And there's a small plaque there. We were walking around and I'm like, well, wait a minute, what's covered in moss here? And, always an observer, and saw that this was, the CCC did a lot of work here. And the more I dug, the more I found out, I'm like, wait a minute, they've done this in Massachusetts. PBS has a wonderful documentary on the CCC, and it's just very intriguing because the CCC, to me, seems to get lost with other New Deal projects, whether it's the TVA or Social Security that came out of it, so forth and so on.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to start looking for those plaques in the places I go to, because like you, I'm probably just walking right by them without realizing their interesting history. Well, speaking of history, and Anthony, I think students of history make the best teachers of history. So tell us the origin story of the CCC. Whose idea was it? Why was it designed specifically to work on conservation projects? And what were those projects? How extensive was it?
Well, at the end of the day, the genesis of the idea came from President Roosevelt. Now, you're talking about the election of 32. You're already several years into the stock market crash, and there's no hope. And you're dealing with two major calamities. You're dealing with an economic crisis, and then you have, a climate crisis, very similar to what we're dealing with today, right? And, how do you address it? And Roosevelt, who was governor at the time, had a deep appreciation for the outdoors, was an outdoorsman before polio struck, had planted trees at his Hyde Park home, had gone to Campobello, had traveled worldwide and had a deep appreciation. And then he started a smaller program like this when he was governor of New York, of employing young men and dealing with soil erosion. And then, when he got elected, he didn't get sworn in until March. Very different today, right? The president gets sworn in January. At that point, he got sworn in March, and he was dealing with probably the brightest of people who were. And he always believed that there are no problems, simply solutions. And he wanted to take it head on. He saw that the program in New York worked well. And you had all these young men who, were available, and we had an issue that needed to be resolved, and he put them to work. So, he looked at it. It was an environmental issue. How do we get money back into the economy? And let's put them to work. And for example, historic Williamsburg, was built during the Great Depression. The Rockefellers paid for that because they had all these unemployed carpenters, electricians, and plumbers, and that was a private entity. But think about all the public projects like the Jefferson Memorial that was built during the Roosevelt administration.
Yeah, I went to William and Mary, which is a next door neighbor to Colonial Williamsburg.
Campus.
And so I remember knowing that certainly that the Rockefellers had funded that. But I never made the connection before with the same historical era. and the vast amounts of unemployment that followed the Depression and the need to absorb that labor market in construction projects or other kinds of things. So thank you for
That's
that,
right.
Anthony. Well, tell us a little bit more then about the kinds of projects that they worked on, maybe some examples of different ones, and just how extensive this program was across the country.
Yeah, you had, every state had a camp, even the territories. Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands had camps. And think about it, within a 3-month period, the President Roosevelt gets inaugurated in March. Within a 3-month period, he's employing 250,000 men.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, you had to be between 18 and 25. Okay, you had to be, really at the poverty level. So a lot of the states had already had that documentation. Who was at the poverty level? Unemployment by 1933 was 25%.
Astonishing.
The stock market had crashed. Stock market was down 90%.
Yeah.
So you had to be 18 to 25 to work. 10% of the American population at that point was African American. So 10% of the workforce in the CCC had to be African American. And the only other people that were allowed to get in were World War I vets.
Okay.
Now, Roosevelt was Undersecretary of Navy during World War I. And a lot of these World War I vets were young men. They're probably only in their 30s. So they had an opportunity to bring money in. And, these guys throughout the country, they assisted in fire control measures. They worked with the national parks. They built animal shelters, water and storage basins. They did fish rearing facilities, built roadways and ranger facilities, constructed wildlife refuges and overlooks. They reseeded grazing lands. My talk on the CCC, I call it 3 billion trees because they almost planted 3 billion trees.
Also astonishing.
So you had all this, you had this cataclysmic environmental issue where, the dust, the good soil had eroded away because in the turn of the century, you had all this tree cutting, and the soil, when there'd be a heavy rain, would wash that very good soil. And also the farmers at that time, they just took one land. It was Roosevelt's words, we were just bountiful. We had enough trees, we had enough land. So they would ruin this land and go to the next plot of land. And there was no technique to it, no conservation plan. And all these young men throughout the country did some remarkable work. Acadia National Park. Great place to go. Those roadways and range routes were built by the CCC.
Wow. So it's a huge legacy in terms of positive environmental impact.
Yes.
Both creating beautiful places to visit, but also repairing and restoring parts of the environment that had been, I want to use the word desecrated. Well, I'll use the word desecrated by unwise farming practices that just in kind of a thoughtless and uninformed way would devastate the land and create conditions that made it harder to actually grow crops. So it was kind of a self-defeating farming practice. But then with all those trees, the billion trees, that's going to help keep the soil in place. It's going to, take care of a lot of carbon also from the environment.
And create these different ecosystems and protect the wildlife that we're dealing with today that is endangered.
Yeah. And it also gives employment, but also meaningful work to a huge core of people who otherwise would have been, floundering is the word that comes, floundering and impoverished is the word that comes to mind.
Yeah, I'd like to touch upon that. Mary, we spend most of our life working. So how do you identify yourself, right? And that's what I try to tell my students and people. You identify yourself where you're from, your family, and what you do for a living. And these young men, they had nothing. And these, these teenagers and then early 20s, and what Roosevelt provided for them was hope. So now they're getting at 8, they're working till, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock. They're working 8-hour days. A lot of these boys worked on the farms. They had worked longer. A lot of these young men didn't even have a, 8th grade education. So now they're getting lifelong skills. They're being trained. They can take some courses. They're getting fed 3 meals a day. Some of these guys got fed cornbread and warm milk in the morning and afternoon, and cold milk and cold cornbread at night. So these guys finally got, a good meal, 2 pairs of shoes, and education. Secondly, they get paid $30 a month. In 25 of that would go home. So now you're rebuilding the economy. And wherever these camps were, they needed potatoes and bread and meats and milk and water. So now the economy is starting to get moving along.
Yeah,
And
because there's a ripple effect, is what you're
absolutely,
describing, that if you employ people and give them meaningful work, well, they need food, they need sustenance, and that means that farmers get employment, that
that's right.
grocers, retailers. So it's a chain reaction that's very positive, and that
Yes,
lifts all those boats.
that's right.
They're linked together. But
That's
the
right.
other thing it strikes me is you emphasize hope, Anthony, which is such a critical resource for our culture, for our economy, because I think if you have massive amounts of unemployed people who feel like there's hopeless and they're not cared about by the culture that they live in, that's a population that is susceptible then to all kinds of malign influence. And history proves that over and over again. So this was such a hopeful and constructive and positive way to resolve a lot of current problems, but also to prevent future problems that could have developed from that. So,
I mean, I think that if you take a look at the election of 32, I mean, I think a lot of people were just angry at the US government and that, maybe capitalism isn't the way to go.
yeah,
Maybe we need to look at the socialist way of doing things. And they were socialist and communist candidates at the time.
yeah,
And Roosevelt, don't forget, Roosevelt had disappeared off the scene and then came roaring back in the mid to late 20s because of polio. It's interesting. Eleanor Roosevelt would say that polio gave her husband the patience to deal with both the Great Depression and Adolf Hitler at the same time.
wow,
It's an interesting insight by
it
her
is, yeah,
because he came up with all these alphabet agencies. But the CCC was the closest to his heart, and he loved being with those guys. They called it the Tree Army, and it was controversial naturally. But back in the 1930s, and my father was born in 33. You look at pictures from Life magazine, Look magazine. There's usually the picture of the Last Supper, and then there's a picture of President Roosevelt. These people would rip out the pictures of President Roosevelt in a newspaper or a magazine and put it up on the wall because they said, what do they always say? He gave me a job. He
yeah.
gave me a job, and that reverberates. It's so important.
Yeah, because a job, especially in this country, is such a, as we were saying, a critical part of your identity.
That's
So
right.
you got a job, you got a livelihood, but you also got an identity. You're part of the economy. You're making a contribution, which
That's right.
we need. We need to feel significant,
Right.
or we can drift into despondence. Well, and I relate to what you're saying about FDR. Both my parents were World War II vets, and
Oh, okay.
my mother in particular was just a huge fan of FDR. I knew I knew about Fala, his dog,
Yeah.
from an early age, and she used to talk in a very poignant way about just how sad, how grief-stricken the whole country was when he died. So I grew up understanding just the emotional impact that FDR had on millions and millions of Americans who saw him as on their side and
Yes.
working to really help them, really caring and working to help them. And he was such a magnificent orator, of course.
Yeah.
Well, I did want to ask you, Anthony. So the CCC was for men only. And I wanted to ask you what the reason for that was. Maybe it was just a symptom of the times, or were there other factors that went into that, the dedication of this program for young men only?
Well, I think that it was a symptom of the times. I mean, the man was the breadwinner and working and running the house. In a little bit of the research that, I've done or listening to audio and video, also you have an issue where you mix the sexes in one camp. I mean, you're already dealing with some form of racism, right? With the black
Yeah.
population and
Yeah.
the white population, but to put women in there. But I also think that they were looking, this is going to be hard work. And the view of women at that time was very different than it is today in the 21st century. So, and a lot of these guys, they would talk about it, that they were very, scrawny and whatnot, and they bulked up. And Holly Jolly, who was a professor in Texas, World War II vet who joined there and wrote extensively about it, says, you healed the land, you healed the man.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
well put.
and he was from Texas, and
Yeah.
he saw the mesquite and all that and clearing it out, and that all these guys did the same thing, that I got to be outside. I mixed with people. I always thought that I might have been better than, this type of person or better than that person. We're all the same, and we're all doing the same type of grunt work. And it was a great learning experience. And actually, these are the men that became the foundation for the U.S. Army heading into World
Mm,
War II, because we didn't have
mm.
a very active army at that
Oh, that's interesting. Another positive ripple effect then.
time.
Um,
Absolutely.
well, Anthony, it was clearly a very effective program. And what do you think were the factors that were responsible for its success and its effectiveness as a program? How was it able to accomplish what it did? Because not every government program certainly is effective and successful in the myriad of ways that you've just been describing. What made it work so well?
Well, at the beginning, it was very skeptical, right? I mean, you're dealing with, like I said, there's a lot of similarities to today. You had economic, insecurity, so you had this massive unemployment. Is it going to be a budget buster? So you had members of Congress saying, how much, we're already in debt, how much money are you going to apply to this? What the aggression, the fascist governments that were rising, and the communist government in Europe and Asia, is he creating his own little army, similar to what Mussolini and
Oh,
Hitler would eventually do? So it was very, there's all that rumor mongering and caution. I think there's he took the men out of the bread lines
hmm
and put them to work. You
hmm
had this ready source of labor. Now, labor as a whole was concerned because there's going to be low wages, and then would that set the wage rate moving on? But so there was that concern. But he put a union man at the head of that.
Oh,
And so, that's how brilliant of a politician he was. But you're getting all these men, you're feeding them, you're clothing them. You have a need where you're rebuilding the beauty, the natural beauty of this country. So and also giving them a skill set. So it's not just I learned how to be a welder, and they were welders, and they were architects, and they were men who were very highly educated that were lost their jobs, who ended up working for the CCC.
hmm
So you had these architects and draftsmen who said, okay, now they're assigned to camps and they help design the projects.
hmm
So, you just keep building on top of something. And they got educated. If you wanted to learn, everyone learned how to read and write, because you had a lot of people who
hmm
didn't. They got to learn how to do that. It was run by the army, so they were figured out how to make a bed, get ready for reveille and be productive during the day. They got great health. They learned how to type. They learned how to read. They learned how to do math. They knew how to learn how to be an architect or do something with science. All these great things. Again, like I said, laid the foundation for the American Army. But at the end of the day, it's them and their children that become the environmentalists and the conservationists for this country.
Yeah.
So all these men and women who went to World War II and the horrors that they saw, when they came back, they wanted peace. They
Yeah.
knew what war was like. So now they got to enjoy the fruits of their labor. And then you have this real rise
hmm
post World War II of the national parks. And it's them and their children who become this movement for conservation.
hmm Well, that's fascinating, Anthony, because the work that they were doing was out in nature, saving nature, improving nature, and that means both that it's healthy for them, as you've been talking about, but it also means they're having experiences every day outside amongst creating parks, creating woodlands, experiencing the healing benefits of nature. There's been a tremendous amount of research in the last 10 or 15 years, scientific evidence of how good experiences in nature are for us cognitively, emotionally, culturally,
Yes.
in every possible way. And so what you're also doing then is creating this, an environmentalist and conservationist mindset that post-World War II then would be ready to support the expansion and the support of national parks, which is one of our most important national resources. So once again, this program this ripple effect just continues, even today, because that's one of the legacies then that the CCC left behind is the National Parks Network. In fact, related to that, then I wanted to ask you, how do historians today, or people in general, view the legacy of the Civilian Conservation Corps? Are people appreciative of the many impacts that it's had?
That's a great question. I think that unless you're taking a government or American history course in college, or you do a specialty like what I'm doing, not many people know who the CCC are.
Yeah.
And that generation of people that, like your parents or my parents, they're gone now.
Yeah.
So, the national parks, the last 5 years, you've been reading about the national parks are being loved to death because everyone's really taking advantage of the great
Yeah.
resource that they are. I think that people in general look at the public spaces as their spaces, which is very important. That they want to make sure that the spaces are maintained well, they're policed well, that they're preserved. I think that if they don't know necessarily the foundation or the history to it, that's what my job is, to try to share that information.
Yeah.
I remember when the CCC turned 70, I wrote an article in the newspaper about it. I think that when I mentioned the CCC, people just look at me, quizzical, and like, what are you talking about? They know what the Social Security is, the GI Bill, and think about the GI Bill employed men and women who eventually became the engineers who put me in on the moon. But the
Yeah.
CCC just kind of fades to the back. They know, some people might know, oh yeah, it was an alphabet agency, but the long-lasting effects. When I'm walking in Braycott or Harold Parker State Park up near me, I'm walking on a pathway, and my son is looking at trees that were planted or built by the CCC. And those names are anonymous, but think about all those hands and fingers and those nails and hammers that had to be made, audited.
Yeah.
The money that was sent to the coffee shop to bring sandwiches over. I mean,
Right.
that's the legacy. And as a person living on the North Shore, or when I go visit Arcadia National Park or another national park, I'm a beneficiary, just like others, of all that great work and that vision. Because Roosevelt said, and we hear it today. Roosevelt said, "We're not doing it for today. We're doing it for the benefit of future generations."
Yeah.
And we have to we have to keep that up.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're saying, Anthony, to me is further evidence of how important it is for us to learn as much history as we possibly can.
Yes.
Because then gratitude is good for the soul, and there's also research that proves that. And I think being able to have a sense of appreciation for all the things you just mentioned, especially the human lives that were involved in constructing this resource. And we do love our public spaces, we do love our parks, but having a sense of appreciation, they didn't happen by themselves. It took human beings to envision them and commit to building them, and to leadership by a president as visionary as FDR was. So thank you for that, Anthony. Well, you said something that I wanted to ask you to expand upon. You said that of all the New Deal programs, it's the CCC that's still relevant today, and that looking at the program reveals that today is not that much different politically, economically, or environmentally than the 1930s. And I was hoping that you could say more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I've worked in the public sector for my entire career, right? I've worked in government my entire career and then naturally as an educator. I know how government works. I've seen the good and I've seen, stuff that, it's a slog, right? You're trying to get permitting or whatever. It is what it is. I think that, and I might alienate some people, when President Reagan said that government isn't the solution, government's the
Yeah.
problem, that cast a pallor on the good work that government does.
Yeah.
And I think that's been forgotten. I think that, to your point, a lot of people don't understand civics. A lot of people don't understand history. And there are a lot of people, there's apathy out there. And they might complain, but they don't vote.
Yeah.
And I think that, the CCC was the foundation for, the Peace Corps, City Year, America Corps, the Teach for America. So that was the foundation. And I think that, what we're dealing with today, particularly over the last 10 years, with political, I don't want to say political uncertainty because it was really uncertain back in the 1930s, but this political rhetoric that is troubling. You have an economy that is, fluctuating all the time. And we're dealing with, a rising sea level and an environmental change. And that's something that's been forewarned about since the Great Depression. And we didn't do anything about it. And now we're in the last chapter trying to solve it. So I think that sometimes you could look at history and say, maybe we need to look at that. How do they problem solve and apply that to today? And you see a lot of the green spaces that are now being built and how they buffer up against sea level rise, because the 100-year storms now happen every year.
Yeah.
And how do you address that? And there's a lot of smart people working on that. And I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of those good people. But I think that if we just focus, because also look what's happening in Europe and Russia right now. How's that any different than what happened in Italy, Russia, and Germany back in the 1930s with aggression?
Yeah.
So, I don't want to sound melodramatic, but it'd be nice just if we could all just focus and say, this is what we need to do. And we're starting to do that. The last couple of years, with solar and looking at green energy and all that stuff, that's important. But I think that if you could look at the CCC and give young men and women the opportunity to be constructive and be participatory, that's so important. I think that gets lost.
Well, those are excellent points of comparison, Anthony. And yeah, it seems like you're describing it's not coming. We're in the middle of these struggles right now. We're absolutely, they're unfolding every day as they're around us. But sometimes I think one of the missing ingredients today can be what you were talking about with such eloquence about the CCC, and that's hope and effectiveness together, because I think they're related to one another. And I think a lot of the way that what's happening today, the political struggles, economic struggles, environmental, imminent catastrophes in the making, they can lead people to feel like there's nothing they can do. It feels like it's just too big, that experts are working on it. As you say, experts are developing solar power and this and that, but for ordinary citizens, it can often feel as though, well, we're just watching this happen. And I think what's distinctive, as you've been describing the CCC, is that it was a massive program that enlisted the hearts and minds, bodies and souls of all these millions of young men to learn how to care and to feel like they were being cared about, and therefore they developed a care for their environment, and they could feel both hopeful and impactful. It gave them something to do. And I often feel as though, of course, we all need to vote. That's something we can always do, and we can donate what we can. But I often have felt as though people probably also would benefit from having something hands-on, tangible that they can do. And there's the potential there to get more millions of people involved and actively feeling like we are changing the world through our very efforts, not just, in the ways we can, but something additional. And does this make sense to you?
It makes perfect sense. I mean, to be honest with you, Mary, I love my college career, but if I had to redo it, I would have taken a gap year. Right. Yeah. And, we hear all these complaints about the education system. Maybe the government needs to step in and say, you're going to have a gap year and you're going to participate in reforestation or do something to that effect. So there's ownership. It's the same thing whatever you are, whether you live in your community or you're at a school. You could either be an observer or a participant. And when you're a participant, you have more to your voice. It's more tangible and you have more ownership.
Yeah. And more hope. Because I think there is hope in feeling, that your efforts are tangible. You're exerting yourself in the service of something that feels like a good that you care about.
And I think that, and look at the man. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt was a rising star, and then he was put in a situation of hopelessness. He always believed he would walk again. But he was in a situation of complete hopelessness, gave up. So that's a person, we're all fallible, right? No one's perfect. But here's a guy who had no hope. He was a young man when he was stricken with polio, but he gave all this hope to generations of people and employed over 2 million young men that helped this country rebuild, and they got healthy, and he just loved it. And I think that says something about the character of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yeah, he really transcended very harsh kinds of realities that he had to deal with, that for a lot of us would have just taken us off course. But for him, it created a new course, and a hugely impactful and meaningful course. Yeah, what a remarkable character.
Yes.
So, Anthony, this has been just fascinating. I thank you so much for
Thank you, Mary.
for the research that you've done, because I think it is a missing chapter in the alphabet programs
Yes.
that's really hopeful to hear about, that our country and FDR with his vision pulled this off, and it has a lingering impact and legacy that we all enjoy every time we go to a national park. We might not be knowing that it was the CCC that contributed to that, but they did. And so thank you for your research, and thank you for coming on the morning show to share it, Anthony. It's always a joy. I love talking to you, Anthony. Keep researching.
I will, Mary. It's always great to see you. Stay well. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I look forward to seeing you and talking to you again.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you so much. Well, that's
Bye,
it
Mary.
for today's show, everybody. Please join us next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Until then, take care and be well. Bye now.